Colonel Andrea Wallace was driving home after an early morning meeting at the local community center. The sun was shining, and it seemed like a perfect day. Andrea, wearing her military uniform, felt proud as always. As a highly respected Army officer, she had spent her life serving others, not just through her military duties, but also as a mentor in her neighborhood. As she drove past a busy road near the edge of town, something caught her eye. A young boy, no older than 8, was standing alone on the side of the street. He looked scared, his face red and tear-streaked. His small hands clutched a worn backpack, and he kept looking around as if searching for someone. Andrea's instincts kicked in immediately. She slowed her car and pulled over. Her heart ached at the sight of the child, who was clearly lost and frightened. Andrea got out of her car and approached him gently, making sure not to startle him. She crouched down to his level, offering a warm, reassuring smile. "Hey there, buddy. Are you okay? Are you lost?" she asked in a soft voice. The boy nodded, tears welling up in his big brown eyes. "I can't find my mom," he said, his voice trembling. Andrea's heart melted. She knew how terrifying it must be for the little boy to be alone in such a busy area. Cars zoomed by, and the noise of the city seemed to make him even more anxious. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's going to be okay. I'll help you find her," she said, her voice calm and steady. The boy looked at her uniform and seemed to relax a little. "Are you a soldier?" he asked quietly. "I am," Andrea replied with a small nod. "And soldiers are here to help, right? So let's figure this out together." She quickly asked him his name and where he had last seen his mom. The boy, who introduced himself as David, explained that they had gotten separated while crossing the street. He had been too scared to move, worried that he'd get even more lost. Andrea glanced around, scanning the area for any sign of a panicked parent. She spotted a small park nearby and figured it might be a good place to start looking. Holding David's hand, she led him toward the park, keeping him close to ensure he felt safe. As they walked, Andrea reassured him, telling him funny little stories about how she once got lost as a kid and how her parents had found her. David started to smile through his tears, feeling safer with every step. What Andrea didn't know was that someone was watching her from a distance. A police car had just pulled up to the curb, and Officer Mark Reynolds was eyeing the scene with suspicion. His hand rested on his radio as he observed Andrea and David walking together. Andrea and little David reached the park, which was filled with people enjoying the sunny day. She walked with purpose, scanning the crowd for anyone who might look like they were searching for a child. David stayed close by her side, holding her hand tightly. "Do you see your mom anywhere, David?" Andrea asked softly, crouching down to his level so he wouldn't feel overwhelmed. David shook his head, looking nervous. Andrea gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry. We'll find her. Let's keep looking," she said with confidence. As Andrea continued walking through the park with David, she noticed a few people glancing at her. Most of them smiled when they saw her in uniform, but a few gave curious looks. She didn't pay much attention. Her focus was entirely on helping the boy. Meanwhile, Officer Mark Reynolds, who had been watching from his patrol car, decided to follow them. From a distance, he couldn't hear their conversation, but he noticed Andrea's uniform and the boy's nervous body language. Mark's thoughts started racing, and he assumed the worst. Mark stepped out of his car and called in a report on his radio. "Suspicious individual spotted with a child in the park. Could be a possible abduction," he said, his tone serious. Unaware of the officer's growing suspicion, Andrea spotted a woman at the far end of the park frantically talking to a park security guard. She looked upset, and Andrea's instincts told her this might be David's mother. "David, do you think that's your mom over there?" Andrea asked, pointing toward the woman. David squinted, then his face lit up. "Yes, that's her," he exclaimed, his voice filled with relief. Andrea smiled warmly. "Let's go reunite you with your mom," she said, gently leading him toward the woman. But before they could reach her, Andrea suddenly heard a firm voice from behind. "Ma'am, stop where you are and let go of the child," the voice commanded. Andrea turned around to see Officer Reynolds standing a few feet away, one hand resting on his holstered belt. His expression was stern, and his eyes were locked on her. "Is there a problem, officer?" Andrea asked calmly, sensing the tension in the air. She held onto David's hand protectively. "I need you to step back from the child immediately," Mark said, his tone sharp. "I've received a report about suspicious behavior." Andrea was taken aback. "Suspicious behavior? I'm helping this child find his mother," she explained. "He's lost." Mark narrowed his eyes, clearly not convinced. He noticed her uniform, but seemed to dismiss it. "I'll need to see some ID, ma'am," he said firmly. Andrea nodded, trying to remain calm despite the growing tension. "Of course, officer," she said, reaching into her pocket for her military ID. David, sensing the seriousness of the moment, clung to Andrea's side, his small voice breaking the silence. "She's helping me. She's a soldier. She's nice." But Mark's suspicion wasn't easing, and the situation was about to take a dangerous turn. Andrea stood still, trying to stay calm as Officer Reynolds glared at her. She could feel her heart pounding, but she didn't let it show. She had dealt with stressful situations before, and she knew that staying composed was the best way to handle things. "Officer, I'm just trying to help this child," Andrea said, her voice steady but firm. She pulled out her military ID from her pocket and held it up so that he could see it clearly. "I'm Colonel Andrea Wallace with the United States Army. I've been helping this boy find his mother." But Mark didn't take a step closer. Instead, he continued to stare at her with suspicion in his eyes. Andrea was starting to feel uncomfortable under his intense gaze. "I don't know about that," Officer Reynolds said, his tone colder now. "I've been told to keep an eye on you. You don't look like someone trying to help." Andrea couldn't understand what he meant. She had always prided herself on her honesty and integrity. What was it about her that made him doubt her? She was just trying to reunite a child with his mother. Mark's hand was still resting on his gun, and Andrea could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I'm not a threat, officer. I'm here to help. If you don't believe me, we can walk over there together, and I'll introduce you to the child's mother." But Officer Reynolds didn't move. Instead, he took a step closer to her, and his voice grew more forceful. "I said, step away from the child. Now." Andrea was confused and growing frustrated. She had been helping this child, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. She glanced down at David, who was still clutching her hand tightly. The boy looked terrified, his face pale, and his wide eyes were filled with confusion. "Please, I just want to go to my mom," David whispered, his voice quivering. Andrea knelt down next to him, trying to comfort him. "It's okay, David," she said softly. "We're going to get you to your mom, I promise." But as Andrea tried to reassure the boy, Officer Reynolds made a sudden move. Without warning, he reached for his gun. And in that moment, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Andrea's hand shot out instinctively, not to reach for anything but to protect David, but Officer Reynolds misunderstood her movement. In a panic, he drew his weapon and fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the park, and Andrea felt a sharp pain explode in her side. She gasped, staggering backward, her hand instinctively pressing against the wound as blood began to seep through her uniform. David screamed, his tiny hands reaching out for her. "Colonel." "Oh no, Colonel," David cried, his voice filled with terror. Andrea tried to stay on her feet, but the pain was overwhelming. She fell to her knees, unable to keep her balance. Through her blurry vision, she saw Mark standing in shock, his gun still raised. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted from a crowd of onlookers who had gathered around. People were pulling out their phones, recording the scene, but Andrea's mind was fading. The last thing she heard was David's desperate cries for help. The scene in the park was chaotic. Andrea, the strong and fearless colonel, was lying on the ground, bleeding. People rushed to her side, some calling 911, others standing frozen in shock, unable to believe what had just happened. Mark Reynolds stood a few feet away, staring at her in disbelief, his hand still gripping his gun. The sound of sirens filled the air as paramedics and police arrived. Andrea was quickly surrounded by medical personnel, but the pain from the gunshot was unbearable. Her breathing was shallow, and she could barely stay awake. David, the little boy she had been helping, was crying uncontrollably beside her. He clung to Andrea's arm, unable to understand what had just happened. "Please, don't die, Colonel. Don't leave me," he sobbed. The paramedics carefully moved David aside and worked quickly to stabilize Andrea. As they lifted her onto a stretcher, she could see the fear and worry in the eyes of those around her. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was close her eyes and pray that she would make it through. News of the shooting spread fast. Within hours, it was all over the local news. Videos from bystanders flooded social media, showing Andrea's bravery as she tried to help the lost child, and then the shocking moment when the officer fired. The public was stunned and outraged. How could something like this happen? How could a police officer shoot someone who was clearly trying to help? As the footage went viral, people began to question the officer's actions. Many pointed out that Andrea had done nothing wrong. She was a hero, someone who had spent her life protecting and serving others, yet she had been treated as a criminal. And it wasn't just the shooting itself that shocked people, it was the officer's behavior. The way he had treated Andrea, ignoring her uniform and her words, showed a disturbing lack of respect and understanding. Protests started to grow in the streets. People were marching, holding signs that read "Justice for Andrea" and "Stop Police Misconduct." The outrage was not just about the shooting. It was about the deeper issues of racial profiling, bias, and the need for accountability within law enforcement. People of all backgrounds stood together, united in their demand for justice. As the community rallied, Andrea's family, friends, and fellow soldiers also spoke out. Her commanding officer, General Marcus Taylor, issued a statement condemning the shooting. "Colonel Wallace is a dedicated officer who has served this country with honor," he said. "She did nothing wrong, and this tragedy should never have happened. We will stand with her and demand accountability." Andrea's daughter, Maya, a young woman in her early 20s, appeared on television, holding back tears as she spoke about her mother's bravery. "My mom is the strongest person I know," Maya said. "She always puts others first, and now we need to make sure that she gets the justice she deserves." The community's support for Andrea grew stronger every day. People were outraged, but they were also hopeful that this incident could spark real change. They wanted to see justice for Andrea, and they wanted to make sure that no one else had to go through what she had endured. As Andrea was rushed to the hospital, the world was watching. The battle for justice had just begun. The hospital room was quiet, except for the beeping of the machines monitoring Andrea's heart rate. She lay in a bed, surrounded by a team of doctors and nurses working to keep her alive. The gunshot wound in her side had caused serious damage, and though she was stable for now, no one knew if she would fully recover. Andrea's family was gathered outside the room, anxiously waiting for any news. Her daughter, Maya, paced back and forth, her hands nervously wringing a tissue. Maya was a young woman, just starting her own life, and the thought of losing her mother was unbearable. The strong, confident woman she had always admired now lay in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. "Mom's going to pull through this. She's strong," Maya whispered to herself, but even she could feel the fear that gripped her heart. Andrea's parents, who had raised her with love and care, sat in silence. They were both in their late 60s, and the shock of the event was taking its toll. Andrea had always been their pride and joy, a brave woman who had served her country with honor. To see their daughter like this was too much to bear. As the hours passed, The doctors continued to work on Andrea, carefully monitoring her condition. Her military colleagues, friends, and fellow soldiers started arriving at the hospital to show their support. General Marcus Taylor, her commanding officer, arrived with a solemn look on his face. He had known Andrea for many years and admired her not just as a soldier, but as a person. "We will get through this, Colonel," General Taylor said softly as he approached Andrea's family. "She's one of the strongest people I know. We'll make sure she gets the justice she deserves." Maya nodded, but it wasn't just justice that they wanted. It was her mother's recovery, her safety, and her future. The world had seen the footage of Andrea helping David, the lost boy, and the shocking moment when she was shot. People from all over the country were now demanding justice. But for Maya, it wasn't just about the trial. It was about her mother getting better. Inside Andrea's hospital room, she remained unconscious, her face pale and still. The doctors had done everything they could, but the next few days would be critical. They weren't sure how much of a recovery she would make, but they remained hopeful. The bullet had not hit any vital organs, but the damage to her side and the blood loss had left her weak. Despite the pain and uncertainty, Andrea's mind raced. In her dreams, she saw flashes of the boy she had tried to help, his face filled with fear. She could still hear his voice in her head, asking for help. "Are you okay, David?" she thought. "You're safe now. I hope you're okay." Maya stayed by her mother's side, holding her hand and speaking to her softly. "Mom, I know you can hear me. You've always been the strongest person I know. Don't give up on us now." Maya believed that Andrea could fight through this, but the road ahead was long. The community, the media, and Andrea's family were all waiting and hoping for the day when she would open her eyes again. The fight for Andrea's recovery had only just begun, and the fight for justice was right behind it. The days after the shooting were filled with questions. People all over the country wanted answers. How could a police officer, sworn to protect and serve, shoot someone who was clearly helping a child? The video footage from the bystanders' phones showed Andrea calmly trying to help, and then, in a split second, she was shot. It didn't make sense to most people. The local police department had launched an official investigation into the incident, but the community, including Andrea's family, didn't trust that they would get the justice she deserved. They wanted an independent investigation, one that wasn't influenced by the department or the officer's history. As the investigation began, it was revealed that Officer Mark Reynolds had a history of complaints about his behavior. There had been several reports over the years from people who felt he was overly aggressive or biased, especially when dealing with people who weren't like him. The complaints had never led to serious action, but now, those same patterns were coming to light. Detectives started speaking with people who knew Reynolds. Many of them described him as someone who wasn't always the most approachable or understanding. There were stories of him stopping people for minor reasons and treating them unfairly. His record of complaints was long, but nothing had been done about it. As the evidence piled up, it became clear that Mark's actions on the day of the shooting had been more than just a mistake. His response had been influenced by something deeper, something that Andrea and her supporters feared: racial bias. Andrea's family was determined to keep fighting. Her parents and Maya spoke out publicly, demanding that the truth be revealed. "My mother is a hero," Maya said during an interview. "She risked her life to help a child. And instead of being thanked, she was shot. That should never have happened." Meanwhile, Andrea's medical condition was improving slowly. She was awake now, but the road to recovery was long. She could remember the events of that day, but they felt distant, almost like a nightmare. Her side ached every time she moved, and there were moments when she couldn't help but think about how close she had come to losing her life. But she knew that she had to stay strong for herself, for her family, and for the community that was rallying behind her. Every day, more people came forward with their support. Local businesses offered to cover the cost of her medical bills. Veterans who served with Andrea spoke about her strength and dedication. The public was starting to see her as more than just a victim of violence. They saw her as someone who had been wronged, and they wanted to make sure that she got the justice she deserved. The investigation continued, with more people joining the calls for accountability. Officers who worked with Reynolds began speaking up as well, confirming that they had noticed similar behavior in him before. Some admitted that they had been afraid to say anything, but now they felt it was time to speak out. The weight of their silence was heavy, but they knew that what had happened to Andrea couldn't be ignored any longer. It was becoming clear to everyone involved that the truth was coming out. The case against Officer Reynolds was building, and the hope for justice was growing stronger each day. The day of the trial finally arrived, and it felt like the entire community was holding its breath. The courtroom was filled with reporters, people from the community, and a few of Andrea's friends and family. They all gathered, waiting to see if Officer Mark Reynolds would be held accountable for what he had done. It wasn't just about the shooting anymore. It was about justice for Andrea, and for everyone who had been affected by this tragedy. Andrea sat with her family in the front row, still recovering from the gunshot wounds but stronger than she had been in the early days. She had made a remarkable recovery, though the emotional pain was something that would take much longer to heal. Maya, her daughter, was by her side, squeezing her hand for comfort. Andrea was nervous, but she knew this was important. She had to be there, not just for herself, but for all those who believed in her innocence. The courtroom was tense as the trial began. The prosecutor, a passionate and determined woman named Linda Hayes, stood up first. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "What we have here is an officer who used unnecessary force on a person who was simply trying to help. Colonel Andrea Wallace is a hero. She was helping a lost child when Officer Reynolds shot her. This is not a case of self-defense. This is a case of a man whose actions were driven by bias and fear." The room grew quiet as the prosecutor continued, presenting the video evidence of the shooting. The footage, captured by a bystander's phone, showed Andrea trying to calm David and help him. And then, without any warning, Officer Reynolds raising his gun and shooting her. The jury watched in silence, clearly moved by what they were seeing. Many of them had seen the footage before, but seeing it in the courtroom, with Andrea sitting there as a living testimony to what had happened, made it all the more powerful. Next, the defense team stood up, ready to argue in favor of Officer Reynolds. They claimed that he had acted out of fear, that Andrea's movement toward her pocket had made him believe she was reaching for a weapon. He was trained to protect himself and others, the defense lawyer argued. In a high-pressure situation, he made a split-second decision. We cannot say with certainty that his actions were motivated by anything other than the need to ensure his safety. But the prosecution wasn't convinced. They presented more evidence showing Reynolds' history of complaints and his previous confrontations with people he deemed a threat, even when they weren't. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't a simple case of self-defense. It was a man acting out of prejudice, someone who saw Andrea as a danger without reason. Then Andrea took the stand. The room grew silent as she stood up, her body still healing from the wound, but her voice strong and clear. "I'm not here for revenge," she began. "I'm here because I want this to be a lesson. No one should ever feel afraid to help another person. What happened to me should never have happened." Her words struck a chord with everyone in the room. They could see the strength in her eyes, the determination to make things right, not just for herself, but for others who had been wrongly treated. It was one of the most powerful moments of the trial, and it would stay with everyone for a long time. As the trial continued, it became more and more evident that justice for Andrea was within reach. The jury listened carefully, and many of them were already starting to understand just how wrong Officer Reynolds' actions had been. The courtroom was filled with tension as the trial came to a close. Andrea sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of the moment. She had shared her truth, and the evidence was clear. Now, all they had to do was wait for the jury to make their decision. Maya sat beside her, her heart racing. She knew how important this was, not just for her mother, but for everyone who had been affected by what had happened. The entire community had rallied behind Andrea, and now they all hoped that justice would prevail. The judge stepped into the courtroom, and everyone stood up as he took his seat. The room fell silent, and all eyes were on the jury. They had deliberated for hours, and now it was time for the verdict. The foreman of the jury stood up, his voice clear and firm. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Mark Reynolds, guilty of reckless endangerment and misconduct." A wave of relief washed over Andrea and her family. The courtroom erupted in quiet whispers, but Andrea sat still, trying to absorb the words she had just heard. It was over. The man who had shot her while she was helping a child had been found guilty. The prosecutor, Linda Hayes, stood up with a look of satisfaction. "This is a victory for justice," she said. "It is a victory for Colonel Wallace, for her family, and for the entire community who stood behind her." Andrea's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Maya. They had been through so much, but today they had won. It wasn't just the conviction of Officer Reynolds. It was a reminder that even in the face of injustice, there was hope. The judge addressed the court. "Officer Reynolds, you will be sentenced in the coming weeks. Until then, you are remanded to custody." Andrea's heart ached a little as she heard the judge's words. While the trial had brought her some sense of closure, it didn't erase the pain of what had happened. She would always carry the memory of that day, the fear in the child's eyes, the pain she felt in her side. But now, she could begin to heal. Outside the courtroom, the crowd was waiting. News reporters and community members were gathered, eager to hear from Andrea and her family. Andrea took a deep breath and stood up, supported by Maya and a few of her friends. As they walked outside, the crowd cheered. They had waited for this moment, just as Andrea had. The victory was hers, but it was also theirs. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for anyone who had been a victim of prejudice, and for anyone who had ever stood up for what was right. Andrea spoke to the crowd, her voice strong despite the emotions she was feeling. "Thank you to everyone who supported me. This is not just my victory. It's ours. It's a victory for fairness, for kindness, and for justice. I will continue to fight for what is right, and I hope this case shows everyone that we can make a difference." The crowd erupted in applause. Andrea had shown them what it meant to stand up for what was right, even in the face of danger. And now she could finally begin to heal, knowing that the truth had prevailed. Weeks passed after the trial, and while Andrea's body continued to heal, her heart was still burdened by the events that had shaken her world. But in those weeks, she found comfort in the support that never wavered. People from all walks of life, friends, family, strangers, had reached out to her, offering their prayers and encouragement. The conviction of Officer Mark Reynolds had brought relief, but it was only the beginning. Andrea knew that true justice wasn't just about one person being held accountable. It was about making sure nothing like this would ever happen again. With her newfound strength, Andrea decided to turn her experience into a force for positive change. She founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting fairness and compassion in law enforcement. The mission was simple: to provide better training for police officers, focusing on empathy and de-escalation rather than fear and aggression. The foundation would also support families who had been affected by police violence, helping them find their voices and seek justice. Andrea worked tirelessly, knowing the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But she believed in the power of community and change. "One person can make a difference," she often said, echoing the words that had driven her throughout her career. She knew that if she could help even one family avoid the pain she had experienced, it would be worth every moment of effort. Her story spread across the nation, and soon her foundation gained support from people all over. Veterans, community leaders, and even some members of law enforcement reached out to lend their help. Andrea had become a symbol of resilience and hope, proving that no matter how deep the wound, healing was possible. Maya stood by her side every step of the way. The bond between mother and daughter grew even stronger through their shared mission. "Mom, you're changing the world," Maya said one evening as they sat together, reflecting on all they had accomplished. Andrea smiled, her heart full. "We're changing the world, Maya. We're doing this together." The foundation's work began to attract attention from lawmakers. Andrea was invited to speak at national conferences on police reform, and her voice became a powerful tool for advocacy. She was not just a victim of injustice. She was a leader, guiding the way toward a better future for everyone. Though Andrea's life had been forever changed by that tragic day in the park, she no longer viewed it as just a painful memory. Instead, it had become a turning point, the moment that sparked a movement. Her courage and determination were lighting a path for others to follow, and she was proud to be leading the charge. As Andrea continued her work, she never forgot the child she had helped that day, the child who had been the reason she was shot. She often thought about David and hoped that, one day, he would grow up in a world where kindness and justice weren't rare but the standard. Her legacy was clear. She had fought for justice, for change, and for a future where everyone was treated fairly, no matter their background or where they came from. Andrea Wallace was more than just a soldier. She was a hero who inspired the world to be better.